One final topic, and we will dispense with this relatively quickly, American foreign policy in the 1920s. In the aftermath of World War I, the majority of Americans had become convinced that our involvement in the war was unnecessary and that we had made a grave mistake. Instead of just freeing the world for democracy and civilization, we perhaps had overestimated the German threat. We got into a war where our interests were not clearly at stake. And what did we get for it? 350,000 dead and wounded, riots and instability in our cities and in our streets, a wrecked economy, the possibility of a communist revolution, and people began to really regret our involvement in the war. And this had a big impact politically on our decision not to join the League of Nations. The League of Nations, of course, is the forerunner of the United Nations. It was Woodrow Wilson's idea. So this was an American proposal, and interestingly enough, the United States did not join this organization because the American public was largely opposed to this. As the most powerful country in the world, the idea was that everyone is going to be seeking our assistance, our intervention, our help, and at some point in the future, we're going to get dragged into another war that is none of our business, and that the best way to avoid that is to stay out of the League of Nations. So a lot of people will recall the idea that in the 1920s we were an isolationist country. That's true to an extent, but I think that word is too strong. A country as powerful and large and influential as the United States cannot be literally isolationist. What we were more is like insulation. We were insulating ourselves from the possibility of becoming involved in other wars. And so we don't do anything that would increase the risk of us getting involved in another war. And in that sense, we were isolationist. Now, we still had interests and problems overseas that we had to engage with. The United States saw the Caribbean and Latin America as a vital American interest. Our possessions across the Pacific, the open door policy in China, these are all parts of American foreign policy that you can't just isolate yourself from, but you can stay away from issues and policies that might involve you in another war. And so, in that sense, we were isolationist. The United States did engage in activities that it thought were likely to promote peace. And I have these examples listed for you in the PowerPoint, but we'll very quickly review them. Looking back on World War I, a lot of diplomats and intellectuals thought that the arms races between the major powers were a huge contributing factor to the war. And so in 1921, the United States hosted the Washington Naval Conference. And there was ultimately a treaty. Then the idea was arms control, that we're going to put legal limits on the size of navies. And hopefully this will prevent arms races, which will help to prevent a second world war. Germany, after the war, was saddled with heavy reparations payments that it had to make to Belgium and France and to an extent Great Britain. And this had a devastating effect on the German economy in the immediate post-war era. And according to the thinking of a lot of American leaders, if Germany did not recover from the war, that would just make it more difficult for the rest of Europe to recover from the war, and it might make another war more likely. And so the United States engaged in a policy towards Germany. It was called the Dawes Plan, where we, using our financial resources, were able to assist Germany to structure its payments to the Allies for reparations without going bankrupt. And so again, the United States involving itself in an issue with the hope that it would diffuse conflict and prevent a future war. A third major example is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Kellogg was our Secretary of State, Briand was the French foreign minister, and looking back at World War I, there was this idea that the general atmosphere of suspicion and fear of your neighbor created an atmosphere rife for conflict that made war much more likely. So the Kellogg-Briand Pact was simply a statement that when your country signed this document and signed this treaty, you were making a clear and open statement to everyone in the world that your country would never be the first to resort to warfare. And I mean, it's silly when we look at subsequent events with World War II and so forth. But at the time, this was seen as an important symbolic gesture to assure one another that no one had evil designs and that no one was plotting to start a war, and that you don't need to operate under those kinds of assumptions. So the bottom line is the United States had buyer's remorse and regret over involvement in the First World War. We were determined not to get involved in another one. We were insulating ourselves to the greatest extent possible from being drawn into another war, but we were not isolated in the literal sense. The country still conducted a foreign policy that attempted to diffuse conflict before it came to warfare.